We want to welcome everyone to our webinar this morning. Today we'll be talking about the release of Thriftly 2.2 with a focus on measuring API metrics and how that relates to Thriftly. Now, just to give you guys a little update on Thriftly. We've been on the market for 4 years, originally as Evolution, now as Thriftly. And Thriftly is handling some fairly large websites now with up to 700,000 monthly page views. And it's also being used in a hybrid application stack model where Thriftly sits in between an existing application that may have data hosted on a customer premises, but then provides a web-based interface through a SaaS model, that sort of thing. And we're seeing that as a very common use case for Thriftly. And one of the things that we also wanted to mention is that Thriftly is now including full Unicode support, has for a while now. And of course, this is very beneficial depending on the programming language that you happen to be using. But that's something that has recently become a big deal, and we've had some questions about it. And but with the new release of Thriftly version 2.2, mostly what you're going to find is that we have a system that is even easier to use. There are fewer breaking changes, and there will be fewer of those going forward, since most of the core of Thriftly is now in the state that we've been trying to get it to over the last couple of years. And a lot of the features that you'll see going forward don't require anything from you as an application developer to integrate with your application. So what's new for Thriftly version 2.2? Well, first off, we've added GRPC support, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a couple of minutes. But that's related to Google's protocol buffers and an RPC framework for that. In addition to that, we've added raw access to the JSON Web Token interface. And again, we'll go into that a little bit more. One of the big changes is that we now have a free forever deployment license included with Thriftly version 2.2. And basically, this is a way for you to use Thriftly on a small scale basis for free. And so we think that'll help a lot of developers give Thriftly a try, maybe even set up a test server that way that they can use against a small scale application, or to try out our application stack on a more permanent basis. So it's a free forever license. We'll talk about that a bit more as well. Another big change is that we've revamped some of the documentation. Our example code is better, the screenshots have been improved, and overall the documentation is more detailed and better organized as well. So that's based on some feedback we received that way. And so that's something where you'll continue to see improvements, where we're adding more depth to some of our documentation there as well. But the big item that we're going to spend quite a bit of time on during today's webinar is related to metric support. We've added Prometheus metrics support into Thriftly, and this is something that doesn't require any code changes at all for you to make use of. It's just one of those built-in things. And so we're very excited about this. We think that this enables a lot of new uses with Thriftly, and really it gives you a window into your application stack that way as well. But first, let's spend just a couple of minutes talking about this GRPC support. So this is something based on protocol buffers. Protocol buffers is something that Google created, that they describe themselves as a XML-like system. It says right on their website, think XML, but smaller, faster, and simpler. As we know, XML is, over the decades, proved very useful, but also it's very large and can be quite complicated to use as you get into some of these bigger document sizes. So protocol buffers is a data serialization format that is a binary serialization. It's not human readable, but it's very fast, many times faster than XML, and also many times faster than JSON serialization. And gRPC is a RPC layer added on top of that serialization. So if you were to look at protocol buffers just on their own, they allow you to describe a document in XML terms, if we were to think in those sorts of terms. But what we need is the ability to make a remote procedure call with this. So it's not just the document, it's what you want to do. What's the action that you're trying to execute on a server? And protocol buffers doesn't have that, but gRPC, which is a variation on just the protocol buffers implementation, adds this RPC layer into it. And one of the things that ends up being a huge benefit here is, much like what we have with Thrift support in Thriftly, gRPC has very broad cross-language support. And really what we're doing by adding it into Thriftly is increasing some of the languages. We're increasing that language count from which this is available. So for instance, Dataflex isn't a language that had gRPC support. Delphi was not really there yet. Well, by having this available in Thriftly, those languages now have gRPC support. And because this is just another protocol for us, there's no code changes from you to get gRPC support with Thriftly. You install the update and that becomes one of the protocols that you have access to. And much like Thriftly, gRPC, or excuse me, much like Apache Thrift, gRPC is very fast. So because this is a binary protocol, in fact, the implementation is, if you look online, you can find comparisons between Apache Thrift, Apache Avro, another one out there, and gRPC, kind of showing how similar they can be and where they may differ in speed in various situations that are very specific to that protocol. Well, gRPC very often comes out on top or number 2 behind Apache Thrift. So having support for this, it just gives us another one of those high-speed protocols that's an option in more languages. So for instance, if you needed to interact with Dart or Go, neither of those have very good Thrift implementations, but for gRPC, those are first-class languages. So implement where you may have a hybrid application stack and developers working in those languages, you now have the ability to make calls from those languages into maybe your legacy application stack. The next feature that we want to mention briefly is our raw JWT support. And really, as we mentioned there, this is a dog fooding discovery. This is something that, as we're working with Thriftly internally, because we use Thriftly on our projects as well, this is something that was discovered as a need in that way. And essentially what this allows us to do is, if we have a situation where we have multiple API servers, maybe handling different portions of our application, sometimes there's a need for one server's API to have access to another server's API calls, but there's some authentication that may need to take place that's user specific. There may be limitations based on the user that is making a call that need to be passed around that way. So in this case, a client may have a JWT token. They're calling to a server that then needs to make a call to another server. Well, normally what would occur is that the server that receives the first call would decode the token and verify its authenticity. And then, of course, we've got all of our stuff built in for handling, for handling the authorization and authentication there. And normally that would be as far as you could go. Well, with our raw JWT support, that token can be passed in its original form, unaltered, onto server 2 for another call, so that that client's rights and authentication and authorization, whatever they had built into that token that is theirs, can be passed on to another server so that they're verified against that second server, and that keeps the client from having to make that second call. Instead, server 1 can make a call to server 2 in that case. And this is something that we find useful in a microservices environment, where you may have your services broken up into many small pieces. That way you need to pass these tokens around. And so our raw JWT support allows that to happen very easily. So it's a small feature, but one of those features that ends up being very useful. The next item we want to talk about is our free forever deployment. Now, we found that this is something that will be good for test servers. The way our licensing worked prior to this, to today, was essentially you would get a 30-day deployment license that gave you unlimited access to a Thriftly server for just a 30-day period. And we found that that really didn't fit our customers' needs quite as well as we thought. And so we think the free forever model here is going to work much better. Rather than having an unlimited server for a limited period of time, now you'll have a limited server for an unlimited period of time. So it's made for a small server. It accesses just a single gateway for all endpoints worldwide, rather than accessing our network of gateways that we have for purchase licenses. And it has some limitations in place. It limits the call size to about 32K, and it also limits the number of calls that can take place. So I believe the limit is 1 call per second, and it allows a bursting as well. So up to 5 calls can take place in 1 second, but then there's a timeout before another call can occur. And we think for very small servers, for personal projects, things like that, that really this will just run those, and you don't need to pay a penny to us to make use of this. And you get a single server activation with your free forever deployment. And for test servers, for these small projects, we feel that this is going to let you try out Thriftly and not have to worry about having to ask for an extension on a trial, those sorts of things, and also have that test server available to you without having to worry about a purchase as well on that. So this is something that's coming out today. Now, there is, for existing individuals that have had trials before, you'll receive an email in the next probably week or so that will basically delete your prior trial that you had that was the 30-day trial and enable this free forever trial so that you can give that a try. So just wait for that email to arrive, and at that point you'll be able to activate your free forever license. The next item that we want to talk about, and really the one that we're going to focus on today, is related to our metric support. And so what we've done is we've added what's called a scrape, a Prometheus scrape, into Thriftly. And Prometheus is a tool for monitoring and alerting on your server. It was originally built by SoundCloud. It's open source. And really, it's not only the collection of that data, but it's also a time series database. Time series involves the measurement of how things are changing over time, and it's a very specific data model that they support within Prometheus that allows for high-speed calls that way. By having a time series specific database, they can kind of optimize around the type of data you would see there. And so Thriftly now includes a Prometheus scrape that is always running when a Thriftly now includes a Prometheus scrape that's always running when you have a Thriftly server running, and it tracks 7 separate metrics related to your application and also to Thriftly itself. As I mentioned, no code changes for this. There's 0 configuration to do in Thriftly. It runs on a standard port. And if you have an existing Prometheus server, you can put in the address of the Thriftly scrape and start collecting that time series data directly from Thriftly. And so This allows for all kinds of things related to debugging and also seeing how your API responds in different situations, so it can help you optimize your code. And also it can be used to see how your API is growing over a period of time. So there's lots of different ways you can make use of this data, and you can also create some pretty nice looking dashboards with it. But one of the things that we found is that Prometheus itself doesn't look that great. It's very good at collecting this data, and it does let you do some graphing, things like that, and we'll kind of show that to you, but it really doesn't present the data all that well. And this is not something that we discovered or anything like that. The industry at large really acknowledges this fact. And so what's turned out to be a good solution for this is to pair Prometheus with another tool called Grafana. Grafana basically makes Prometheus look pretty. It's a dashboard and graphing composer tool, so it lets you build customized dashboards that are making use of the time series data that's stored in Prometheus. And Grafana can connect to other things as well. Prometheus is just one of the time series tools it connects to. But really, it gives you the ability to make these beautiful dashboards for your Prometheus data very easily, and those dashboards can then be published. But in addition to that, it also has a built-in notification system. So one of the things that you might find over a period of time with your Prometheus data is that you can kind of see how your server is performing health-wise. So for instance, let's say you have a process that's starting to run away on you. Maybe it could be something as simple as an index optimization issue where the wrong index is being used for a call. And initially it's no big deal and it seems to work fast enough, but over a period of time, the latency on that specific API call starts to increase. Well, Prometheus is the tool that's going to record that data for you, but Grafana can sit in there and you can set some limits on your APIs so that you can say, okay, if the response time goes above this for this period of time, or if the number of calls per second spikes, or whatever the case may be, whatever you want to track, you're able to do that in Grafana and have it notify you about those things. So really talking about time series data, it's a hard thing to talk about. You really have to see it to understand it. And so now we're going to actually take a look at both Prometheus and Grafana and see how they work with Thriftly. And for that, we're going to turn our presentation over to Paul Royer, one of our developers here, and he's going to demo this for us. Paul?
All right. Thank you, Oliver. Hold on, let me switch to my screen here. So yeah, I'm going to basically run through the setup process for Prometheus and Grafana, and then I'm also going to show some dashboards and features that he mentioned. So as you can see here, I have a VM with a small API running. It's just a really basic example with a few calls. And because it's running, as he said, as long as you're running version 2.2 or greater of Thriftly, it's automatically serving up the time series data on port 9290. So what we're going to do is we're going to set up Prometheus first to grab that data and start to record it. And to do that, you can go to Prometheus.io and you can just go to download. You come down here and we're going to get this is a release candidate. Use at your own risk. We've tested this up to version 2.5. So it's right here. I've already downloaded it. So once you download it, you'll notice it's a tar file. So you'll probably need a tool to extract that. I'm using 7-zip. It's free and open source. Most of you are probably familiar with it. So we'll open this up. It doesn't require an install. It can run directly from the folder. So I have a little metrics folder here that I made. I'm just going to extract it into my metrics folder. It'll take a second. So once that is extracted, oh, there we go. You can come in here, and the only thing we need to do to get Prometheus to start capturing our Thriftly data is we need to add it. We need to add the scrape as a source. So this Prometheus.yml file, I'm going to edit it. Again, I'm using Notepad++. It's a free and open source tool if you need something to edit this file with. And down here, you'll see these scrape configs, and there's already a static config set up for Prometheus, and we're going to add Thriftly to this so you can start capturing the Thriftly data. And you'll notice in our documentation on this setup process, we have the entire what your config should look like if you have a default install. So we're only concerned with this line down here, but if you want just to be safe, you can just copy, paste the whole thing. So we'll come over here. There we go. So you'll notice down here at the bottom, it added the Thriftly deployment on localhost port 9290. So if I save that and I come over here and run the Prometheus executable, it's running now. Server is ready to receive web requests. So if I come over to my browser now and I go to localhost, it runs on 9090 by default. And let's just make sure it's working. If I start typing, it's supposed to pop up with my Thriftly metrics. Oh, that's the wrong port. Sorry about that. Let me try again. There we go. It wasn't auto-populating there for a sec. So Thriftly runtime request bytes total. Let's just run that. Let's see what our totals look like. So it's not recording the previous, because we just installed it, it only has the most recent metrics. But as we leave it running now, it will begin to record the time series data over time. But we can see the most recent set of totals. And this is broken down per method. So you can see here the same methods you saw over here: join to upper, get length, and reverse. It has call total bytes here broken down by method. So we can see a graph of that if we want. We can kind of zoom in. Again, as we record more over time, these graphs will become more interesting and dynamic. And side note, if you plan on using this and you start realizing that you want to be able to manipulate the data, combine it in different ways, Prometheus has a querying language built around this, and their documentation is actually pretty good. So there's a lot of things you'll probably realize you want to do with this data and analyze it and combine it in different ways. They have a whole breakdown if you're of all the different functions and operations and everything that are available. One that I found useful that I used a lot were these aggregation functions. Like sum, min, max, average, standard deviation. It really lets you kind of manipulate the data to get the stats you want. For example, real quick, I can show you here, if instead of having it broken down by all of the individual methods, if I just wanted a total, how many bytes have I used for all my requests combined, all I have to do is put a sum around this. And if I execute it again, now it's a one metric. So we'll see how that works when we get to some of our fancier graphs, but that's how easy it is to set up Prometheus and start capturing the data. So then we want to make it look pretty. As he mentioned, we can connect our Prometheus to Grafana. So we'll go to grafana.com, and again, we'll just download it. Come to Windows. You can click right here and get the most recent version. I've already downloaded it. So here's Grafana. I'm going to put it in my same metrics folder. Grafana also just runs from the folder. There's no install or setup or anything. Just extract it and run it. There is one small change we'll need to make to the config on this one as well. So as soon as it's done extracting, we'll take care of that. So we'll come over here to Grafana. In the configuration folder here, this sample, we're going to copy it, and we're going to call it custom. And again, edit with Notepad++, and I'm going to do a search for HTTP port. The default is 3000. I'm going to change that. Just I may have something else running on 3000, so I'm just going to change it to 8282. I'm going to save it. We're going to come back here to our main folder. We're going to go to bin, and we're going to run Grafana server. Oops. The first time you run it, it's going to take a second to set up all of the tables and web interface and everything. It has a pretty nice web interface, so we'll wait for that. And it looks like it's done. Come over here to localhost 8282, and it's going to require that you log in. The first time, it's admin and admin for the name and password. And it'll ask you to change your password. And you'll notice you'll be presented here with your home dashboard, and it's conveniently, it provides kind of a timeline of the steps you're going to want to take in order to use it. So we just finished installing. So we'll just click here on Add Data Source and Prometheus. Make sure this default checkbox is checked if you want to use Prometheus by default for all of your graphs and charts. We're going to use the default URL for Prometheus. Unless you changed it, it should be port 9090 on localhost. And there's some other things you can set up here. For this example, I don't need any of this, but if you wanted to set up some basic auth or the scrape interval or methods, things like that, we're just going to hit save and test. Data source updated. So now if we come back to our home dashboard, we're done with that. The next step would be to start creating some dashboards. So if I come in here, we'll use the same example I used in Prometheus. So we'll set up a chart. If you come up here and you click edit, we'll change the name to total data requests. And if I come over here and start typing Thriftly, since we're connected to our Prometheus data source, it gives us our recommendations for all of our Thriftly metrics here. So if I scroll down, I want this one right here, request bytes total. So we can see that it has the same data that was in Prometheus, but it looks a little nicer. And in the legend, it took the entire data source name. So down here, you can format the legend. If we just wanted to show the methods, the method name as there you go. So now our legend looks nice. We have our 4 methods here. We have our metrics showing up. So up here, you have some quick access ranges. So if we look at the last hour, and you can use that same Prometheus query language in here. So if I want to combine all of those stats and just look at the total sum, there we go. And then over here, if we go to display, we can change, let's see, axis. So on the left y-axis, instead of using a short, it's data, right? So if we come over here and we say kilobytes, you'll notice here it updated this. So it's showing the correct data, right? That metric was, it's bytes. So let's change it. There we go. So we can see we've used a total of 3.3 megabytes. Since this data started being recorded. Now, last week I recorded a bunch of data so that we could take a look at some fancier, little more interesting graphs. So what I'm going to do, because this runs from a self-contained folder, I can go ahead and close out of here, and I can shut this down, and I can run it from my other folder that already has a bunch of data recorded. So let me get some of this out of the way. I have an examples folder here. I'm going to run Prometheus. And even the data itself is self-contained in this data folder. So that's why I can just run this separate instance of Prometheus from a different location, and it's going to have all my previous data saved. And then I'm also going to run Grafana. So now, if we come back to localhost 8282, we'll log in again. You'll notice on this one, I have two dashboards saved that I previously configured. So we'll go to the data example. And this is all data from last week. It's a little more fun to look at. We can see here that we've used the total up here is the same, but this one has all of the time graph, time series data. And if I go ahead and select a chunk, you'll notice all of these views in this dashboard update at the same time. So we have our request and response totals. So that one should grow over time. This one is our rate for our request and response. We can see every time, we get a spike where a bunch of requests are coming in. And then down here are the totals by method, and I have them stacked. So you can see kind of, if one call is getting a lot more traffic than others. Let's zoom back out and we can take a look at an example of that. I think it might be this one. Yeah, so on this one you can see, we had a burst here where our join method actually started taking a lot more calls than our other ones. So you can really quickly, easily visualize that. And then this over here is just a chart in 5-minute increments giving us our total calls. So, if we wanted to go back and compare a different time period and do some math and see exactly how many calls came in when, that gives us the ability to do that. So let's go back to previous week. Let's look at this big spike right here. So we can see that the calls were pretty even and it was a lot of traffic, but this really doesn't give us any idea of as far as performance, right? So I have another graph here, or another dashboard with some advanced stats from a performance point of view. So we have the same data set here. We can see the calls per second on this one. So let's come to this first little one right here. We'll notice, there was only 0.25 calls per second happening on that one. Well, let's go to this next section here. All right, so one thing Oliver wanted me to point out, when I first started collecting this data, I was actually using the free forever version. And you'll notice that even though the client that was generating the calls was making requests at about 2 or 3 calls per second, with the free forever version, it'll start rejecting calls. So you'll see that it stays pretty steady right around 1 call per second on the free forever version. And then once I registered a basic license, we can see the rates go up. Now let's look at this one spike right over here where we saw all of those requests coming in. We'll notice here that there were 2 spikes, and let's zero in on just like a chunk of one of these. And if we look down here, as we zoom in on this, our average call latency does start to become affected once we get up to about 15 calls per second, because this is a basic license. It's running on one process on one endpoint. So, the latencies will start to go up. And so I may say, hey, I'm concerned about anything over 15 or anything over 10. It looks like we may get to a point where performance could become a concern. So I could come up here to this guy, and if I go to edit, you'll notice right here there's this alert tab. So what I can do is I could create an alert, and you can set it manually down here, or it'll add this little bar, and I can just drag this down. So I'm just going to say at 10, anytime it goes over 10, I want to do something. And we have a few options here, but let's just say I want to send an email to myself. And so in real time, while this is running, if I save these settings, it's going to send me an email anytime this calls per second goes above an average of 10. So that's really useful, right? If you want to keep track of this stuff and know when certain things occur, as he mentioned, you may need to adjust, you may need to, pool resources or upgrade your license. This is a really good way to be able to quickly be notified and visualize what's going on with your Thriftly endpoints.
Hey,
And
Paul,
yeah,
can you go back to the prior view where it showed the latency on those calls right
sure.
there? Yeah. So one thing just to mention about this data view here, where he's seeing this, you can see in that average call latency now, it's showing, into red on that call latency. But if you notice where it was maxed out at the high point for it, where it's showing like 0.55 right in there, or zero point 0.7, that's 0.7 milliseconds.
Yeah.
So, this is on a single process and on this server, and, we still are dealing with response times that would allow well over 1,000 calls per second to occur from it. So, it's red from that standpoint. Overall, in relation to a Thriftly server, 15 calls per second, that's not really taxing it. And you can tell that even by just looking at that call latency. If we were dealing with a call latency that was getting into hundreds of milliseconds, that sort of thing, well, then maybe we're dealing with a different issue there. So, this is one of those ways that you can tell, is my server getting overloaded? What is my call latency? What is my dispatch latency? Am I seeing clients that are having to basically wait in a queue because Thriftly will do that if it gets overloaded? Are they having to wait in a queue for their call to come in? All of that can be done using these tools. You can see that data visually from here and set up dashboards that are customized for your application stack.
Yeah, I set these numbers low intentionally just so I could show off some of the but that was all set manually by me. If you come over here, obviously you can set those ranges. I set them extremely low, my thresholds, just so you could see the dynamic, kind of pretty color stuff. But obviously, 0.5 milliseconds is probably not a concern. It was more just for a visual representation of, hey, this is what you can do with it. So yeah, that's how easy it is. All you have to do is download it, some small configuration changes, and run it right from the folder. And as long as it's running, it's capturing that data, and you can take advantage of that.
Thank you, Paul.
Sure.
So, as maybe just kind of show you some of the graphs in here while I mention a few things about this.
Okay.
So, the idea behind this is when you go and look at some of these API tools that are out there that are cloud-based tools. So when you look at, for instance, the offerings from Microsoft and Amazon, metrics end up being a part of that. And so, there are ways of tracking those metrics if you were hosting Thriftly in the cloud, as some of our customers do using Azure, for instance. You could put an Azure API gateway in front of a Thriftly API and track a lot of this data as well. But, if you're hosting it locally, if you want to be able to collect this data and analyze it yourself, and, some of those gateways can get up in price. Well, being able to do this on your own, to collect that data, analyze it, optimize your API, debug your API even. This can be used even on a local machine where you want to watch what's going on within a series of calls that are occurring. As you get into a microservice architecture, some areas of complexity can appear in your application with records being in various states at different points that could cause issues, things like that, where you may have API calls that get stuck waiting for some other API call to take place, things like that. Being able to have a tool to analyze that data and see, I can see I'm getting stuck here specifically, or this call seems to be having a lot of contention on a resource because it's taking longer than it does when it's running on its own. Those are great little things you can do to optimize your application. but then also collecting this data and being able to present it to customers as well, show them how their application is responding if you're a developer that way, or even for yourself to be able to say, okay, how is my API performing? I need to present this to maybe the CEO of the company. They want to see some graphs of how things are performing. All of that's very easy to do rather than having to manually go through this process. Now you can collect that data. Someone has a question about it. You go into Grafana, and as you can see here with the query language available, with the time series tracking where you can look at a specific period of time, that sort of thing, you can really massage the data however you need to get that information out of it. And so we think this is a very nice feature that really we want to see what you guys can do with it. And I would expect that in the future you're going to see even more of those metrics that are available. Paul, maybe you can bring up the list of metrics that are supported in Thriftly right now. So right now we have 7 metrics. They're described here. Some of the descriptions are a little short there, but they're pretty obvious what they're doing. And we're going to be adding more to this in the future. So these are the ones that we're starting with. These are the ones that we think are most important for working with your application. But in future versions, we can add to this. And again, you're not going to have to do anything except install the new version. No code to change to get access to any new metrics that are added that way. And as you can see, installing and using Prometheus and Grafana is a pretty simple process. This video is, this webinar is going to be, of course, put onto our website so that you have the ability to kind of go through that process with Paul and see how to set all of this up again, although the instructions are in our documentation as well. So that is really what we wanted to talk to you about today. Now we want to open this up to any questions you may have about this. And so while we have that available, Paul, let me ask you a couple of questions about this.
Sure.
So when this is, you really didn't have any experience with Grafana and Prometheus before we started down this path, correct?
Zero. Yeah. A couple of weeks ago, you asked me, hey, I want you to, do the webinar for the metrics. I pretty much followed our documentation myself, and actually, fixed a couple little parts of the documentation where things didn't line up, but it was my first time ever using either of those tools.
And so the process that you went through there with learning Grafana, that sort of thing, did you make, are there tutorials, or did you just kind of figure it out on your own?
Yeah, they both have pretty decent documentation. The querying stuff helped a lot, as far as getting rates and sums and how to kind of manipulate the data. Definitely take a look at the Prometheus documentation. That was probably the most useful thing. And Grafana also has pretty extensive documentation as far as not so much, a lot of times in the Grafana documentation, it actually says refer to the Prometheus query language, so they're aware of each other. And between the two documentation tools, you can do a lot of stuff with it. There was only a couple times where I got stuck, but for the most part, it was pretty straightforward.
Gotcha. And are the dashboards something that can be shared, or do you know on that at all?
Yes, actually, you can set up user accounts. You noticed how I logged in as admin. You can actually set up multiple user accounts and groups, and so you can actually, if you wanted to set up a user group that only has access to certain charts, or write only read, you can. There's different roles and groups and users you can set up within Grafana to give people access to different things.
Gotcha. We do have a question that came in here. Why is collecting metrics important for someone considering moving to a services architecture running in the cloud? Well, really the key to your cloud rollout is knowing that a lot of times people have I guess there's a few issues. People have issues figuring out what do I need to allocate for these servers that I'm running in the cloud. That's one question that we often hear. Is this server big enough? And sometimes what developers do, or small ISVs do, is they just try a server and then see what the performance is. And certainly, pretty quickly you find out, okay, this server's underpowered, that sort of thing. But using a metrics tool allows you to actually track that and say, okay, is my server performing well in this case? Thriftly is one source of data for Prometheus, but you can also go out and get other scrapes for Prometheus that are collecting statistics about your machine, statistics about disk usage, things like that, that maybe Windows is collecting. You can also bring that data into Prometheus as well and start to get kind of a big picture. Also, we're only collecting data from one server, but in a cloud architecture, you may very well have a whole bunch of servers, and you may have certain customers complaining about performance or something like that. How do you track down exactly what's occurring that way? Well, again, having these scrapes available on each and every server, collecting that data on all of them, allows you to quickly tell, okay, here's where my performance issue is, and did this change I made, either a code change or maybe allocating more resources to it, did it fix the problem? Those questions are normally hard to answer. In the past, people may have answered them by going, well, I stopped getting complaints, so it must have worked. But by having this sort of data available, this time series data, you can actually answer that question factually. You can see that the response time has dropped, or that the contention on a resource has disappeared that way. So that's really where it becomes important in a cloud environment where things can get complex very quickly. So let's see. Doesn't look like we have any other questions. Let's see, one other question here. Outside of performance, what should I take into consideration when deciding on which protocol to use? Yeah, so the GRPC protocol and the Apache Thrift protocol that are in Thriftly, both of those are very useful for server-to-server communications. Those binary protocols really don't have great support yet within the browser, although both of them do work over HTTP. JavaScript really doesn't work well with those protocols, although we have demoed a system that allows you to make binary thrift calls from the browser. And there is some limited ability to do something similar with gRPC. But really, those protocols work well for that server-to-server communication, where we showed that JWT, the raw JWT support, where you need to move authentication or share authentication between servers. So they work well there. Having a very lightweight protocol that way that doesn't clog up your Ethernet connection when you have a lot of server-to-server traffic, those binary protocols are a huge benefit. And they also have a lot lower overhead from the standpoint of parsing. So when you're parsing that data, when it's being parsed by Thriftly actually for you, the amount of CPU time required is significantly lower. So we've even seen some of them used in mobile environments where you're dealing with a cellular connection which has limitations of its own, and an iOS or Android app. In those cases, gRPC or Thriftly can also be Thrift can be very useful there as well. Okay, well, I think that's all the questions we have. So you can download the new version of Thriftly now. There's, in addition to the features that are in there, there are also bug fixes that we've put in there for various ones who've found a couple of issues. So it's the latest and greatest. It's available on the website now. Give it a try. And if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email, oliver@mertech.com. And thank you for joining us.